Inside the wooden barracks where the prisoners spent their evenings, the laughter found new life and spread like a contagion that fed on shared memory and collective need. Men gathered in small groups, their conversations returning again and again to the same theme: the belief that America might possess size and resources but lacked the refinement and precision that defined true engineering excellence. For these soldiers, pride in German mechanical achievement was not simply patriotism or propaganda. It was woven into their identity as deeply as language or family. They spoke of the tractors they had known in their homeland, compact machines that seemed to dance across the smaller European fields with an elegance that bordered on grace. A former mechanic held court one evening, describing the diesel engines he had maintained before the war, engines whose timing was so precise they responded like a finely tuned orchestra, each cylinder firing with clockwork accuracy that produced a hum rather than a roar. Another man recalled the gears in the machines his father had operated, components polished so carefully they seemed to whisper when they engaged, rather than grinding and groaning under stress. An officer who had overseen supply lines spoke with particular passion, comparing German tractors to the panzer tanks that had once inspired such fear across Europe, arguing that both were products of the same philosophy, that true power came from speed and precision and intelligent design rather than brute force. The other men nodded along, warming themselves with memories of home and the comfortable certainty that German engineering represented the standard by which all other nations should be measured. There was something almost ritualistic in these conversations, as though by repeating the same assertions often enough, they could make them impervious to doubt. One prisoner in particular, a lieutenant named Karl Drexler, who had spent years working at Daimler-Benz before his conscription, kept a small notebook where he recorded his observations of camp life in neat, precise handwriting. His entries from those early weeks, later confiscated by American guards and preserved in military archives, reveal the tenor of those barracks discussions with remarkable clarity. He wrote about how each evening the men would gather and speak of German engines as though they were legendary warriors, armored knights made of steel rather than iron, and how they dismissed American machinery as little more than toys built for farmers who knew nothing of real engineering. The laughter would return in these moments, he noted, and for brief intervals they could feel victorious again, could imagine that defeat was temporary and that German superiority remained an unchangeable fact. What Drexler and the others did not realize, or perhaps refused to acknowledge, was that their pride served a function beyond simple boasting. It acted as a shield against a reality too painful to accept directly, the reality that they had been defeated by men they considered inferior, captured by soldiers they had been taught to despise, confined by a nation they had dismissed as weak. War had shattered their armies, stripped them of weapons and authority, transported them thousands of miles from everything familiar, and left them sitting behind wire in a landscape so foreign it might as well have been another planet. But pride in German engineering that remained untouched, inviolate, something captivity could not confiscate. It allowed them to believe that Germany was still superior in the ways that truly mattered, that military defeat was merely circumstantial rather than evidence of some deeper failing. If their tanks were better designed, their engines more precisely crafted, their machines more elegant in operation, then surely the war's outcome was nothing more than bad luck or numerical disadvantage rather than proof of American strength. This logic provided comfort through the hot Texas nights, allowing men to sleep without confronting the possibility that they had fundamentally misunderstood their enemy. What none of them had yet grasped, what the slow-moving tractors would eventually teach them through demonstration rather than argument, was that the very simplicity they mocked represented a kind of genius they had never been trained to recognize. For the moment, they wrapped themselves in the myth of precision, like a familiar coat, finding warmth in the belief that craftsmanship and careful engineering would always triumph over mass production and utilitarian design. The night sounds of the camp settled around them, the creaking of wooden bunks, the rustle of thin blankets, the occasional cough or murmured conversation, and from somewhere in the distance, so faint it barely registered, the sound of another tractor still working the fields under moonlight. Some of the prisoners drifted off to sleep with smiles on their faces, secure in their conviction that German machines would forever represent the gold standard of mechanical achievement. Yet underneath that surface confidence, invisible cracks had already begun to form, hairline fractures in a worldview that would soon come under pressure it was never designed to withstand. The illusion was still intact, but the forces that would shatter it were already in motion, grinding forward with the same inexorable patience as those tractors they found so easy to dismiss. The laughter came to an abrupt and total end on a morning in late September, when the prisoners were marched out of camp under guard, taken along a dusty road that ran past working farmland near the outskirts of Hereford. The guards had said nothing about the purpose of this excursion, offering no explanation beyond the order to form up and march, and the prisoners trudged along in their usual columns, expecting another work detail or perhaps just a break from the crushing boredom of camp routine. What they encountered when they reached the crest of a low hill defied every assumption they had carried with them from Europe. Spread before them was a vista of wheat that seemed to have no ending, golden stalks stretching toward a horizon that remained forever out of reach, a sea of grain that rolled and swayed under the breeze like something alive. In Germany, farmland came in parcels, divided by ancient hedgerows and stone walls, broken into family plots that had been worked by the same bloodlines for generations, landscapes shaped by centuries of careful husbandry and limited space. What the prisoners saw in Texas bore no resemblance to that familiar pattern. These fields merged into one continuous expanse, a territory of cultivation so vast it seemed less like agriculture and more like the conquest of nature itself, as though someone had decided that the entire horizon should bend to the will of farming. And moving across that impossible landscape, deployed in a pattern that spoke of coordination and purpose, were the machines they had spent weeks ridiculing. Not a single tractor working in isolation, but dozens of them spread across the fields, painted in various shades of green and red and faded yellow, their engines producing a collective growl that carried across the distance like the sound of some massive beast breathing. They pulled equipment behind them, plows and harrows and seeders, working in what appeared to be a carefully choreographed formation, despite their apparent clumsiness. The German prisoners stopped walking without being ordered to halt, their attention captured completely by what they were witnessing. To eyes trained on European farming, the tractors still looked painfully slow, each machine crawling along at that same deliberate pace that had inspired so much mockery back at the camp. But seeing them deployed in numbers, watching them work in concert across hundreds of acres, their slowness revealed something the prisoners had not anticipated. These machines did not stop. They did not falter or pause or require constant maintenance. Hour after hour, they continued their methodical progress, and with each hour, another vast stretch of land was transformed, turned from stubble into furrows, from seedbed into cultivated field. The prisoners watched as clouds of dust rose behind the iron beasts, marking their passage across the landscape like the wake of ships cutting through water. One officer, a captain named Heinrich Voss, who had managed supply logistics during the North Africa campaign and prided himself on understanding the mathematics of war, spoke almost to himself, his voice barely above a whisper in German, slow, but they never stop. The words carried further than he might have intended, passing from man to man down the column of prisoners like a message being relayed, and soon the entire group had fallen into an uncomfortable silence. The joke about American clumsiness no longer seemed quite so secure, no longer felt like the shield it had been. A young farmhand waved at them from atop one of the tractors, his face barely old enough to need shaving, freckles visible even at a distance, his posture relaxed in a way that suggested he had been doing this work since childhood. He steered the massive machine with one hand while drinking from a canteen with the other, treating the tractor like a familiar horse rather than a complex piece of machinery requiring constant attention. For the German soldiers watching from the roadside, men who had survived campaigns in Poland and France and Russia, men who had operated tanks and artillery and vehicles of war, there was something deeply unsettling about witnessing such casual competence from someone so young. The boy looked like he should still be in school, yet he commanded a force that could reshape the earth itself, and he did so with the unconcerned ease of someone performing a routine chore. When the guards finally ordered the column to continue marching, the prisoners moved forward in near silence, each man lost in his own thoughts, processing what he had seen and trying to reconcile it with everything he had believed about American weakness and German superiority. Back at the barracks that evening, arguments broke out almost immediately, men struggling to defend the worldview that had just been challenged by what they had witnessed with their own eyes. Some tried to dismiss the display as wasteful, too much land being used inefficiently, claiming that German methods were more sophisticated because they achieved more with less space. Others insisted that European farming was inherently superior because it required more skill and knowledge rather than simply throwing machines at the problem. But even as these arguments were made, they sounded hollow, defensive in a way they had not been before. The image of those endless wheat fields refused to fade, and no amount of boasting about precision engineering could erase the simple mathematical reality of what those tractors had accomplished. In a matter of days, working the fields at that same slow, steady pace, American farmers had tilled and planted more land than German operations might process in weeks, using smaller machines and more manual labor. That night, Lieutenant Drexler opened his notebook again and wrote a new entry, his handwriting less confident than in previous pages, the words seeming to fight their way onto the paper. "It is not about speed that matters in this place," he recorded. "It is the scale of everything. They build their machines for something we did not consider. We build for beauty and precision. They build for hunger itself. And hunger is always the stronger master in the end." For the first time since their capture, since the moment they had surrendered their weapons and been transported to this strange country, the prisoners began to sense that something deeper than military technology was at play in this war, some fundamental difference in thinking that went beyond tactics or strategy. It was a power that moved slowly and steadily, that had no intention of stopping until it had accomplished whatever goal it had set for itself, that measured success not in elegance, but in sheer, overwhelming productivity. The revelation was not yet complete, but it had begun its work, eating away at the foundations of belief, like water wearing down stone, patient and unstoppable and finally devastating. Days accumulated into weeks, and the men found themselves unable to ignore the relentless rhythm of machinery that surrounded their confinement. Every morning began the same way, with the low rumble of engines rolling across the camp like distant thunder, announcing a storm that never quite arrived. At first, this sound had been merely background noise, easy to dismiss or filter out while focusing on the routines of prison life, but gradually it transformed into something else entirely, a constant reminder that punctuated every hour of every day. The tractors were always present, always working, always moving forward with that same maddening deliberation that had once seemed so worthy of contempt. What the prisoners began to notice, what they could not help but observe through simple proximity and forced attention, was that these American machines possessed a quality entirely different from what they had known in German engineering. Unlike the tractors and vehicles they remembered from home, machines that demanded constant care and skilled maintenance and delicate handling, these American contraptions seemed almost brutally indifferent to rough treatment. Farmers would approach them without ceremony, fill their tanks with fuel in a casual manner, wipe oil-stained hands on dirty overalls, climb into worn seats, and simply start the engines without any of the preliminary checks and adjustments that German machines required. There was no careful warming of the motor, no precise calibration of settings, no ritual of preparation. The farmers treated these tractors the way one might treat a reliable mule, with familiarity, but without reverence. And the machines responded by roaring to life every single time, uncomplaining and ready for another day of labor. They were designed for endurance rather than elegance, built to absorb punishment rather than to showcase engineering artistry. A sergeant named Otto Hahn, who had spent considerable time maintaining Panzer engines on the Eastern Front and took pride in his mechanical knowledge, found himself muttering to a fellow prisoner one evening as they watched another tractor pass by the fence line. "Our tanks were like racehorses," he said, his voice thoughtful rather than boastful. "Powerful, yes, but always in need of care and feeding and attention. These things out there are like iron oxen." The comparison spread through the camp with remarkable speed, passed from barrack to barrack, until men began whispering the phrase Eisenochse whenever a tractor came into view. Iron oxide. At first the term carried a note of mockery, but gradually it acquired a different tone, one that mixed reluctant respect with growing unease. The Americans had understood something fundamental that the Germans had overlooked in their pursuit of mechanical perfection. War was not won by achieving the highest level of craftsmanship or by building machines that performed with balletic precision. War was won by persistence, by the ability to keep functioning day after day regardless of conditions, by creating systems that could absorb damage and keep operating when more delicate mechanisms would have failed. A German tractor might run beautifully when properly maintained, its engine humming like a fine watch, its gears engaging with barely a whisper, but introduce a single flaw or missing part, and the entire machine could sit idle for days while mechanics sourced components and made repairs. The American machine, heavy and graceless and prone to rattling, was built to absorb abuse. It smoked and coughed and leaked oil, made noises that would send a German mechanic running for his tools, but it kept moving regardless. It could operate from before sunrise until long after dark, day after day after day, until entire landscapes had been transformed by the simple accumulation of steady work. One afternoon, the prisoners were assigned to labor details, put to work loading grain sacks onto trucks for transport. And they watched as farmers climbed down from their tractors during brief breaks, poured coffee from dented thermoses, exchanged a few words with neighbors, laughed about nothing in particular, then climbed back aboard to continue the endless routine. Not once during that entire week did a single machine break down while the prisoners were watching. Not one farmer had to halt work for repairs or adjustments. The tractors simply kept going, hour after hour, with a reliability that seemed to violate everything the Germans had been taught about mechanical systems. For soldiers accustomed to the fragile beauty of their own equipment, for men who had spent countless hours performing maintenance on vehicles that demanded constant attention, this brutal dependability represented something close to a philosophical challenge. Perhaps strength did not lie in precision alone. Perhaps true power resided in the ability to endure punishment and continue functioning when more refined systems would have collapsed. That night, the camp grew unusually quiet, the normal sounds of conversation and argument fading into an uncomfortable silence. A few men tried to revive the old jokes about American clumsiness, attempting to restore the mood of easy superiority that had characterized those first weeks. But their efforts fell flat, and no one laughed. The irony was too sharp, too obvious to ignore any longer. They had mocked these machines as clumsy and crude, had dismissed them as proof of American inferiority, yet it was precisely their clumsiness that allowed them to outlast anything Germany could produce. In the dim light of the barracks, Lieutenant Drexler added another entry to his diary, words that would later be discovered by American historians researching prisoner attitudes during the war. "We believed that speed meant victory," he wrote in careful script. "But speed fades when engines fail and parts cannot be found. Here the slow machines prevail because they never cease their work. They grind forward like millstones and there is no stopping them." The seed of doubt that had first sprouted when they saw the endless wheat fields had now grown into something larger, spreading roots through the foundation of their beliefs. Pride in German engineering, once as solid and unshakable as steel itself, had begun to bend under the weight of something far less glamorous, but infinitely more powerful: the simple, crushing force of machines that refused to quit no matter what punishment they endured. The revelation was not complete, but it had progressed beyond mere speculation, moving into the realm of undeniable observed reality that no amount of rationalization could explain away. The full weight of the revelation struck with devastating force when food began to arrive at the camp in quantities that defied comprehension. Each week brought new evidence of agricultural productivity that seemed impossible to the German prisoners. Long trains that rattled past the edge of the camp, with freight cars overflowing with grain and beef and butter and milk, goods stacked so high they threatened to spill over the sides. The men would stop whatever they were doing and watch in silence as these trains passed, their wheels clicking rhythmically on the tracks, their whistles echoing across the flat Texas plains. They had once laughed at the tractors for their lack of speed and grace, but now they were confronting the end result of that slow, steady work. Harvests so abundant they filled endless wagons and required dozens of trains to transport. Inside the camp kitchen, the impact of American agricultural might become a daily reality that none of the prisoners could ignore. Men who had braced themselves for hunger based on their experiences in Germany, who remembered the ration tickets and long lines and empty store shelves, found their plates stacked with cornbread, their bowls filled with beans and potatoes, their cups filled with fresh milk that was never rationed or limited. To soldiers who had watched civilians go hungry in their homeland, who had seen even wealthy families struggle to obtain basic foodstuffs, this casual abundance bordered on the obscene. One evening, a guard made an offhand comment while overseeing the unloading of flour sacks, mentioning that a single tractor could produce enough food to feed thousands of people. The number traveled through the barracks like wildfire, repeated and discussed and analyzed from every angle. Thousands. Each of those slow, ungainly machines that had seemed so worthy of ridicule was not merely an engine pulling a plow, but a factory of survival, a generator of food on a scale that made European farming look like gardening by comparison. Sergeant Hahn, who had been so confident in his assertions about German superiority, admitted quietly to a companion one night that even aristocrats in Germany had gone hungry during the war years, that rationing had affected every level of society, while here in America even prisoners of war were being fed like laborers deserved to be fed. The words hung in the air between them, impossible to deny or rationalize away, a stark comparison that undermined every claim they had made about the superiority of German systems. The irony deepened and became almost unbearable when prisoners assigned to work details at nearby farms watched farmers loading trucks with pork and beef, destined not only for American families but for shipment overseas as well. The guards explained without particular emphasis that much of this food would go to soldiers fighting in Europe, that some would be sent to Britain under the Lend-Lease agreements, that the American agricultural system was feeding not just its own population, but its allies as well. For every German soldier still clutching a rifle somewhere on the front lines, rationed and hungry and making do with whatever supplies could be scrounged, there was a freight car full of American food rolling toward the Allied armies, sustaining them with an abundance that German logistics could never hope to match. What had begun as laughter at slow tractors had transformed into a profound unease bordering on despair. To mock the machines now would be to mock the very system keeping the prisoners alive, to deny the evidence arriving on their plates 3 times per day. Each bite of cornbread, each glass of milk, each serving of meat that appeared without fail, represented proof that those iron oxen in the fields were producing more than any German tractor ever could, and doing so with a consistency that permitted no exceptions. One evening after supper, Captain Voss sat staring at his untouched bread for a long time before speaking, his voice barely above a whisper, but clear enough for those nearby to hear. "These iron oxen are not just feeding cities," he said slowly, as though the words were being forced out against his will. "They are feeding the war itself. They are the reason America can sustain armies on multiple continents while we starve in our own homeland." Nobody contradicted him because there was nothing to contradict, no argument that could be made against the simple mathematics of food production. The contradiction had become inescapable and all-consuming. The very machines that had once seemed absurd, that had inspired such confident mockery, had revealed themselves as instruments of power more fundamental than any weapon. They did not destroy like artillery or tanks, but they sustained and nourished and enabled everything else, creating the foundation upon which military strength could be built and maintained. Without them, armies could not march, factories could not operate, populations could not survive prolonged conflict. The prisoners began to understand, reluctantly and with great resistance, that they had been looking at war through the wrong lens entirely, focusing on the weapons while ignoring the systems that made those weapons possible. If you were standing behind barbed wire in that Texas camp, watching trains full of food roll past, while knowing your countrymen were going hungry across the ocean, how would that reshape your understanding of power and defeat? What would it do to the beliefs you had carried since childhood about your nation's superiority? Would you cling to those beliefs more desperately, or would you let them go and accept a new and uncomfortable reality? These were not abstract questions for the prisoners, but lived experience that ground against their pride like sand in a machine's gears, wearing down resistance through constant friction. By the winter of 1944, the conversations inside the barracks had undergone a transformation that would have been unthinkable during those first weeks of captivity. Where there had once been laughter and confident assertions and easy mockery, there was now hesitation, muttered debates that went in circles, long silences that stretched uncomfortably between men who no longer knew what to believe. They gathered around the pot-bellied stove in the center of the barracks, seeking warmth against the surprising cold of Texas winter nights, and spoke in whispers about what they had observed and what it might mean. Some still clung stubbornly to the old propaganda, insisting that America was wasteful and inefficient, that German methods were superior because they required less space and fewer resources, that precision and refinement would ultimately triumph over brute force and mass production. But these arguments sounded increasingly hollow even to those making them. Defensive positions held more out of habit than conviction. Others, shaken by the endless evidence of agricultural abundance and mechanical reliability, could no longer maintain the illusion that had sustained them through the early months of captivity. One night during roll call, after the guards had moved on to count other barracks, an older officer finally gave voice to what many had been thinking, but none had dared to say aloud. His name was Major Wilhelm Kruger, a veteran who had fought in the previous war and whose hair had gone grey at the temples, giving him an air of authority that even captivity could not entirely erase. He leaned toward a group of younger soldiers and spoke softly, but with absolute certainty. "We did not lose this war because of their guns or tanks," he said. "We lost because they can feed an entire nation with those slow machines we mocked, because they have solved the fundamental problem of logistics and supply that has broken every army in history." The words fell among the men like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples that spread outward in the silence that followed. No one laughed, no one argued, no one attempted to defend the old certainties. It was as though a curtain had been pulled back to reveal a truth that had been hiding in plain sight all along, waiting for someone to acknowledge it directly. In the days that followed, the camp atmosphere changed in subtle but unmistakable ways. Even the proudest engineers ceased their boasting about German mechanical superiority, finding nothing left to say that did not sound like willful blindness in the face of overwhelming evidence. Lieutenant Drexler, whose diary had once celebrated the excellence of German precision engineering, now wrote entries of a very different character. "The Iron Oxen have defeated the Reich more surely than any battlefield," he recorded in neat script. "They have won a victory that artillery and tanks could never achieve, because they have removed the possibility of hunger from the equation of war." What unsettled the men most profoundly was not the tractors themselves, not the machines as physical objects, but what those machines represented about the nature of power and the foundations of national strength. If America could produce food in such staggering abundance, then its armies would never face the threat of starvation, its factories would never shut down for lack of fuel, its population would never reach the breaking point that had defeated so many nations throughout history. War, they were learning against their will, was not fought exclusively with bullets and bombs, but with bread and milk and beef, with the capacity to sustain prolonged conflict without your own people going hungry. And America's bread, its milk, its beef, all seemed as endless as those wheat fields stretching toward the horizon. Some prisoners tried to salvage hope from the wreckage of their beliefs, suggesting that when they returned home after the war, they could build similar systems, could adopt American methods and achieve the same results. A young corporal voiced this idea one evening, proposing that Germany's future lay in copying what they had seen in Texas, but his words sounded thin and fragile against the weight of reality. Germany did not have these vast expanses of fertile land, did not have the industrial capacity to produce machines in such numbers, did not have the resources to sustain agriculture on this scale, even if it wanted to. The comparison was not merely one of different approaches to the same problem, but of fundamentally different circumstances that no amount of will or effort could change. That night, as the distant sound of tractors hummed faintly through the darkness, Captain Voss posed a question to the barracks, his voice low and troubled. "Tell me honestly," he said, "what truly wins wars in the end? Is it the precision and beauty of steel, or is it the abundance of food that never runs out?" The question hung in the air without answer, because every man present knew the answer already, had known it for weeks, but had been trying to avoid admitting it even to themselves. Viewers watching this from your own time and place, from wherever you happen to be in the world, consider the same question honestly. What forms the true foundation of power in human affairs? Is it the machines built for elegance and speed that inspire awe and pride? Or is it the machines that endure, slow and unyielding, until they have fed millions and made victory inevitable through sheer sustained effort? The German prisoners had been forced to confront this question not as an intellectual exercise, but as a daily reality that ground against their assumptions until those assumptions crumbled into dust. And the answer they arrived at, however reluctantly, would stay with them for the rest of their lives, shaping how they understood not just the war they had lost, but the very nature of strength and weakness in human civilization. When the war finally ground to its conclusion in 1945, and prisoners began the long journey back to a Germany they barely recognized, They carried with them more than physical scars and memories of combat. What lingered most powerfully in their minds, what they found themselves unable to forget even when they tried, was not the clash of armies or the thunder of artillery, but something quieter and more persistent. The image of those endless fields and the machines that worked them with such relentless patience. Years and then decades passed. Uniforms were folded away and placed in attics. Ranks and titles became footnotes to ordinary civilian lives. But the memory of those Texas farms remained vivid and immediate. Many former prisoners, when interviewed by historians or when speaking with their children and grandchildren, found themselves returning not to stories of battle in North Africa or firefights in Normandy, but to those tractors crawling across American soil under the summer sun. They spoke of the machines with a tone that mixed respect and something close to wonder, describing not the dramatic moments of war, but the slow revelation that had unfolded behind barbed wire. One former prisoner, living out his final years in a small town in Bavaria, recalled the experience for his grandson with remarkable clarity despite the passage of time. "I do not remember every battle I fought," he said, his voice carrying the weight of age. "But I remember those iron oxen perfectly. They moved so slowly that we laughed at first, but they fed entire cities without ever stopping. That was the real power we were facing, and we did not understand it until too late." His words were not offered as praise of America or criticism of Germany, but as simple recognition of a truth that had been forced upon him through direct observation, a confession that defeat had been written not only on battlefields, but in the furrows of farmland, thousands of miles from the front lines. For many of these men, the image of American tractors became something that returned unbidden at unexpected moments. Whenever they saw farming equipment in their own post-war fields, whenever they encountered agricultural machinery of any kind, they were reminded of that silent realization that had occurred in the camp, the moment when laughter turned to silence and then to understanding, when pride gave way to the acceptance of uncomfortable facts. The machines had become more than mere objects in their memory, transforming into symbols of a kind of strength they had not been taught to recognize or value, endurance rather than brilliance, persistence rather than precision, the ability to continue working day after day until the sheer accumulation of effort became overwhelming. Historians who conducted interviews with former prisoners during the 1950s and 60s noticed a recurring pattern in these conversations. Men who had once dismissed American machinery with confident scorn now spoke, instead of abundance, of trains carrying food beyond counting, of the strange comfort of never going hungry even in captivity. These recollections did not fade with time, but seemed to deepen and grow more significant as the years passed, becoming a central lesson extracted from the chaos of war. Precision engineering had its place, certainly, but endurance built empires and sustained them through conflict. Speed could win battles, but persistence won wars. Excellence in craftsmanship was admirable, but the ability to produce reliable tools in vast quantities was decisive. In their final years, some of these former prisoners admitted to interviewers that their fundamental beliefs about German superiority had been broken more thoroughly by fields of wheat than by enemy tanks, that a machine capable of feeding millions without fail was ultimately more dangerous and more decisive than any weapon designed purely to destroy. They had learned, unwillingly and against every instinct of pride, that wars are won not only by the quality of weapons deployed, but by the bread and milk and harvests that sustain the armies wielding those weapons. A tank battalion can be fearsome, but it becomes useless when the soldiers operating it are starving. Artillery can dominate a battlefield, but only if the crews have the strength to load and fire. Strategy and tactics matter greatly, but they rest upon the unglamorous foundation of logistics and supply. And America's agricultural machines had solved that foundational problem with a thoroughness that made German precision engineering seem almost irrelevant by comparison. And so the story reaches its conclusion not with explosions or dramatic confrontations, but with an image that persists in memory long after the noise of battle has faded. A wide American field at dusk, the sun dropping toward the horizon and painting everything in shades of gold and amber. Rows of wheat swaying gently in the evening breeze, creating waves across the landscape like something alive. And there, moving through this sea of grain, a line of tractors maintaining their steady pace, endlessly crossing the land with their engines producing a hum like distant thunder. Their steady pace serves as a reminder, quiet but impossible to ignore, that the most powerful victories in human history are sometimes achieved not through speed or violence, but through patience and sustained effort and the refusal to stop until the work is complete. When the dust of war finally settled and soldiers on all sides attempted to make sense of what they had endured and what it had meant, not every man remembered the clash of steel or the roar of guns or the acrid smell of gunpowder drifting across contested ground. For many of those who had lived behind barbed wire in the American heartland, the more lasting and transformative memory was something quieter and more humble in its appearance, but ultimately more profound in its implications. It was the sight of fields that seemed to stretch beyond any reasonable horizon, and of machines moving slowly but ceaselessly, like iron beasts grazing on the earth itself, converting soil into sustenance, with a reliability that permitted no interruption. Those tractors, dismissed initially as laughable examples of American clumsiness and lack of sophistication, had revealed a truth that no lecture or propaganda could have conveyed so effectively. Power does not always announce its presence with speed or brilliance or dramatic gestures that inspire immediate awe. Sometimes it is found in endurance, in the quiet persistence that turns soil into grain, that keeps trains full of bread rolling toward hungry mouths across continents, that sustains armies and entire nations alike through conflicts that would break less resilient systems. Against such power, marshaled on such a scale and applied with such consistency, even the sharpest steel and most elegant engines proved inadequate. Decades after their captivity ended, former prisoners told their children and grandchildren not of glorious battles or heroic last stands, but of this unshakable abundance they had witnessed. They spoke of how a machine that seemed unremarkable could feed more people than they had imagined possible, how it could work through day and night until entire cities became dependent on its yield, how it represented a form of strength that transcended military might and touched something more fundamental about human survival and flourishing. In their recollections, which were recorded by oral historians and preserved in archives and memoirs, the tractors became powerful symbols that transcended their mechanical function, serving as reminders that wars are decided not only by force of arms, but by the ability to nourish populations, to maintain production, to endure hardship without collapsing into famine or chaos. Perhaps that explains why the memory has proven so persistent, why it continues to resonate even now, when those who experienced it firsthand have mostly passed from the world. This is not merely a story about technology or agricultural innovation, but about human fragility and the pride that crumbles when confronted with silent, undeniable truth. About the assumptions we carry concerning our own superiority and how those assumptions can be undermined not by arguments or force, but by simple demonstration of capability sustained over time. As the years continue to pass and the voices of that generation fade into silence themselves, the image they described remains vivid and instructive, a wide field under the American sky, golden with harvest, and machines moving slowly, steadily, without any indication they will ever stop, grinding forward with patience that outlasts all opposition, and in doing so achieving victories more complete than violence alone could ever accomplish. Teaching lessons about the nature of power that cannot be learned from textbooks or propaganda, but only through direct observation of what endurance truly means when applied without mercy or hesitation until entire landscapes and nations and wars themselves bend to accommodate its relentless forward progress.